Some years ago, I met a lady whose husband had been savagely murdered by one of their employees. As a result, she was struggling to make ends meet and keep the family business alive at the same time. Now, that was the kind of thing that would drive most people off the deep end. But this lady turned out to be one of the most remarkable individuals I've ever met. With tears streaming down her cheeks, she said, "Pastor Sean, as hard as my life is, I want to tell you something. In spite of everything that has happened to me, I'm not angry. Now, I won't pretend that I don't miss my husband or that times aren't tough without him. But what's really remarkable is how I've been able to forgive the young man that did this. And you know something? I still love God." Now, I can honestly tell you that not everyone responds like that. Some people lash out at God or even give up on Him altogether. So the question is this: what makes the difference? In a world of incredible suffering, can you still believe in God? Stay with us, because today my colleague Mark Finley will be joining me in studio to study one of the toughest questions in the religious world.
It has stood the test of time. God's book, the Bible, still relevant in today's complex world. It is written, sharing hope around the globe. Presented by Sean Boonstra and Mark Finley. Good God, Bad World. Why? Number 4 in the Big 5 Questions About Life.
The other day, I heard a well-known TV personality ridiculing the faith of people who were clinging to God after a terrible natural disaster destroyed their home. As they were evacuating their house, they hung a sign over the window that said, "Jesus still walks with us." Well, that was more than the TV host could take. "Listen," he said, "get real. God is not with you. You're living in a gymnasium after all." And all around the world, I suppose a lot of people nodded their heads in agreement, because they find it hard to believe that a good God can let people suffer. If He really is love, why is there so much misery in this world? I think that's one of the most pressing questions raised by those who wrestle with doubt. So today, I'm delighted to have Pastor Mark Finley with me as we meet this tough question straight on. Pastor Mark, it's great to be with you today.
Sean, in this series, we have looked at the great questions of the Bible and the tough questions that the Bible presents, and we've found that there are answers, and I'm looking forward to tackling today the question of good and evil.
Yeah, and that's the big question. It's the question of the ages. I've read skeptics through all history who ask this: if God is everything the Bible says He is, if God is love and God is all-powerful and God is all good, then where in the world did all of this evil and suffering come from? Did God create evil?
Sean, the Bible does present an amazing answer to that question, and in this case, as in many others, truth is stranger than fiction. Most people picture the devil, if they believe in the devil at all, as a being in a red suit with horns and a long tail and a pitchfork and living in the innermost parts of the earth in a fiery pit. But the Bible says in Luke chapter 10,
Luke 10,
verse 18, these are the words of Jesus, and He said, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven."
From where?
From heaven.
From heaven.
You know, you may wonder, and many of our viewing audience may wonder, how did Satan get up in heaven? Did God create a demon? Well, the Bible helps us to understand that. The Bible does not picture Lucifer or Satan or the devil as a being with this pitchfork and horns in a red suit in a fiery pit inside of the earth. The Bible actually pictures Satan, the devil, or Lucifer as a fallen angel. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 7 to 9, the Bible describes a colossal struggle. Now, unless you understand this struggle between good and evil, some call it the great controversy between good and evil, unless you understand this, you'll never fully understand why there's so much suffering and sickness in our world. Revelation 12, and Sean, why don't you read verse 7 to 9?
It says in verse 7, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels. and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.
God created a magnificent angel called Lucifer. That angel used his freedom of choice to rebel against God. And it is that rebellion that we see here in Revelation chapter 12, verse 7 to 9. There's this war in heaven. Satan deceived a third of the angels. In fact, the Bible says here in the passage that we've read, the great dragon, verse 9, was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. So the question was then, what did Lucifer or Satan deceive the angelic beings about, and what's the essence of this deception? We find the answer to that in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 12 to 14. The Bible draws aside the curtain and helps us to understand this controversy between good and evil. It helps us to understand what was going on in the heart and mind of this fallen angel. In Isaiah 14, verse 12, it says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, the son of the morning! But you're cut down to the ground, you who weaken the nations. For you said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God." So there's a battle for the throne. Lucifer is in heaven, but he wants an exalted position. He wants to exalt his throne above the stars of God. "I'll sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north." Now that's an amazing phrase. The mount of congregation, every Jew knew that that was Mount Sinai. It was north of the camp of Israel. That's where God administered his law. So Satan is saying, I don't want to obey. I want to be the one that gives the law. And so there is a conflict over the throne, a conflict over the law of God. And he says, I'll ascend in the heights of the clouds. I'll be like the Most High. So in the mind and soul of Lucifer, a created being no longer wants to worship his creator. He says God's unfair. He says God's unjust. And God's given him freedom of choice. So God could have slapped him. God could have stamped him out immediately. But the reason God chose not to do that is because the whole universe would have thought that Lucifer was right when he charged that God was unfair and unjust and that his laws were restrictive. God wanted to demonstrate by allowing sin to go on that sin brings disaster, that sin brings death.
See, I think that's a great point. You know, as I'm thinking about what you're saying, I grew up in a house with 3 boys, and what if I had said to my brothers, our father is just a mean person, mean-spirited, and Dad hears about what I'm saying and he takes me out back and shoots me. What are my brothers going to think? Well, I was telling the truth.
Right.
And so if I'm reading you right, you're saying Lucifer in the courts of heaven was not created a devil. He was created a light bearer. He was created a beautiful angel. And yet he started to accuse God of being incapable of running the universe. God is not just. God is not fair. If God would have squashed him at that moment, other angels might have thought, I wonder if Lucifer had a point.
Sure, they would have served God out of fear, not out of love. In fact, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, says precisely the point that you've just made, Sean, that indeed Lucifer was created as a being of perfection.
Now you're in Ezekiel 28.
28.
Okay.
And we'll look there at Ezekiel 28, and we'll start with verse 12, middle of the verse. It says, "You were the seal of perfection,
wow,
full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering." And then verse 17, "Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor." So God created a magnificent angel, a being of dazzling brightness that stood near his throne. This angel coveted God's position. He coveted God's authority. He began to sow lies through heaven. And he said that God was unfair and that God was unjust. This being that God created perfectly corrupted his wisdom by his own choices.
Why create us with freedom of choice? Couldn't God look down through the centuries and see the possibility that an angel might go bad? Why take that risk? Why give us that freedom?
God certainly is all-wise. He's omniscient, he's all-knowing, and he certainly can look down through the centuries and see the potentiality that human beings would make the wrong choice and the fact that they would. But to take away that freedom of choice is not to create a human being, it's to create a robot. To take away that freedom of choice is to create a biological creature that simply responds from his own biological drives. What is it that lifts us above the animal creation. What is it that makes you really you? What is it that makes me really me? Why, it's not the color of our skin or the color of our eyes or how tall or short we are or the color of our hair. That which makes us really us is the ability to make rational choices. To take that away denies our humanness. It denies who we are. So God was willing to take the risk of enabling us to make bad choices. He was willing to give us that freedom of choice, knowing that that was a real risk that we'd make bad choices, because He knew that to take that away destroys the essence of human personality. Let me give you an example. Suppose I could program my children.
Oh, wouldn't that be nice?
Great,
I got 2 little kids.
Yeah, right. I have 3 kids, older now. But let's suppose that every morning I went to a computerized control center in my house, and I put certain buttons in, and my little boy would get up in the morning and say, "Daddy, I will eat my oatmeal. Daddy, I will do my homework."
Now, I've got to say, Pastor Mark, sign me up. This sounds all right.
Right. Then you'd love it when this iron child just put their iron cold hands on your face and said, "Daddy, I loved you." There's nothing like that little girl Natalie of yours or that little girl Naomi of yours jumping on your lap, sleep in their eyes, runny nose, putting their arms around you saying, "Dad, I love you," you know. And so you and I want love that's spontaneous, not love that can be forced, not love that can be coerced. And God was the same way.
I think I can see your point. Unless we had the freedom to choose against God, what does our choice to follow Him mean?
Exactly.
Right? We're following Him out of our own free will. Love is a choice that we make then. It's beautiful. Now, let's get to some of the difficult questions, though. I was reading an insurance policy the other day, and they were telling me they'd cover me for everything except acts of God, right? If God creates a disaster is the impression you get, then they're not going to cover me. Now, where do calamities come from? Where does suffering come from? If there's a devil and there's God, and why do they call it an act of God?
Well, they probably ought to call it an act of the devil, right? Acts of God. God does not create natural disasters to destroy us. It is true that Satan is a very powerful being. These natural disasters are the result of a world that is separated from God. And so when you have a world that's separated from God, human beings are affected. Nature is affected. The environment is affected. All of life is affected in what we would call this planet in rebellion. And so it is true that there are raging wildfires. It is true that there are hurricanes and fires and floods and tornadoes, not as conscious acts of God. But, you know, the Bible says that the earth wears old like a garment. The Bible says in the book of Romans that all of creation groans for deliverance. So the natural disasters that we see are certainly not acts of God, but they are the result of a planet that is separate from God and the result of the activity of the evil one, Satan, who wants to sweep people into premature death.
Now, you're reminding me of an old story. They say it's the oldest one in the Bible, about Job, where Job has wealth, he has a family, he has everything going right, he's a righteous man. He suddenly loses it all. And if I remember correctly, God in that book pulls back the curtain of the cosmos and shows us something interesting. There we find out who was really behind it.
Sure. If you look at Job chapter 1, the Bible talks about a council meeting in heaven, and Satan comes up and he right to the gates of heaven, and beings evidently from unfallen worlds come. The Bible says that they gather together there in heaven, and Satan comes up to the very gate of heaven, and he says to God, he taunts God. He says, "Look at your servant Job. You've given him everything. Just withdraw your hand." And God does not cause Job's troubles, but God allows them to take place to demonstrate a purpose. And through it all, the Bible says Job doesn't curse God. In fact, Job himself says, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." And the Bible says that at the end of the book of Job, most people like to read the beginning of the book of Job, but if you look at the end of the book of Job, on the last chapter of Job, the Bible is quite amazing because Job answers the Lord in Job 42, verse 2. And the 42nd chapter is the last chapter in the book of Job. He says, I know that you can do everything, God. No purpose is hidden from you. And the Bible goes on to say, verse 12, now the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters. And the Bible goes on, and it says that at the end of Job's life, he had satisfaction, joy, and happiness, and far more. Did Job suffer? Yes. Was he faithful in that suffering? Yes. But he came through that suffering far better off. And Sean, you know, there may be somebody here today that's suffering. Maybe somebody here today, you're going through real trial, real difficulty in your life. Like Job, you say of God, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And you hang on in faith and you hang on in trust, and you watch what happens in your life. God will bless it dramatically.
I've got another question for you. You know, and it comes out of Job's experience. Job was a righteous man. Mm-hmm. And I've read other passages in the book of Psalms. The psalmist says at one point, I think it's in Psalm 73, he's lamenting the fact, he says, why is it the wicked prosper? Why do the wicked do well and I'm the one suffering? Now, why is life unfair?
Well, I think at times life is unfair. But wait a minute, there is another way to look at that. Maybe God at times allows wicked people to prosper so that they would see their blessings would come from Him and turn to Him even in their prosperity.
Now that's an amazing thought.
Yeah. So see, maybe the prosperity that some of the wicked receive is certainly not the result of their evil deeds and their cheating ways at times. But maybe a God of love is even trying in the good times of the wicked's life to show that He's lavished them with their love, with His love, and trying to get them to turn to Him. But maybe if that doesn't work, as the song says, in every life some rain shall fall, and maybe the wicked who seem to be prosperous today, if they don't turn to God with the gentle overtures of His love and prosperity, maybe a son dies of cancer, not caused by God, but allowed by God. Maybe a divorce breaks up, a divorce takes over and a marriage breaks up, not caused by God, but allowed as the natural result of their choices by God. And maybe that wicked person who seems, or unsaved person who seems so on top of the world today, maybe they're crushed and bruised tomorrow and they turn to God. On the other hand, maybe some of us who seem to be Christians and are Christians, maybe God is calling us to deepen our Christian experience. Maybe there's, the Bible says, no chastening of the Lord in the book of Romans. At the present time seems joyous, but afterward it brings forth its fruit. So there are times that God does chasten us by allowing us to go through trial to get us to turn to Him.
Right. Well, you know, it reminds me, I had surgery done on both my legs as a boy. It was exceptionally painful. But once the pain subsided, it enabled me to walk and to have a normal life. Sometimes it's surgery, isn't it? It is. Sometimes it really it's surgery. Now, another thing that some people point out is, listen, it's pretty easy for God to sit on the sidelines. He's up in heaven, everything's happy there, and we're down here suffering, and He's not here. You know, Sean, I visited some years ago Dachau, one of the prison camps of concentration camps of Nazi Germany, and I walked through the area where the ovens were, and to sense that people were gassed in the gas chambers and put in those ovens and burned, and the smoke went up day after day after day. As I was walking through the cells, I was very quiet. It was a very meditative moment, and all around in my head there was going this thought, God, where were you? Where in the world were you in Dachau? And I walked into a cell, and etched into the wall by some lonely prisoner were these words, God was here. Amazing. God was here. And I began to think about that, Sean, and I said, you know what? This is where God was. Every time there's suffering, God is there. Every time there's sorrow, God is there. The difference between a saved person and an unsaved person in suffering is the saved person may suffer, the unsaved person may suffer, but the saved person has the absolute confidence because they've made a conscious choice to have God by their side, that He hasn't left them in suffering. God is there. Where's God in suffering? The same place that He was when His Son died. He was there to support and to encourage. I remember reading a poem once that had a great impact on my life. It talked about a man walking down the beach. Yeah. You know that one? Sure I do. And, you know, he looks back over the end of his life and he says, God, you know, I'm a little perplexed.
On the sands of time, there are always two sets of footsteps, mine and yours. And God, I went down in some valleys, and there were two sets of footsteps, mine and yours. I went up in mountains, there were two sets of footsteps on the sands of life, mine and yours. But God, there was a particularly deep valley. It was the greatest problem of my life. My life was crushed and broken. There was only one set of footsteps. God, you left me at that time. Where were you? And in heaven, as the story goes, God looks at him and says, let me tell you something. Did you look at those footsteps carefully? Did you look at those footprints more closely? They are deeper, because during that period of time, I was not walking by your side. I was carrying you.
Amazing.
Exactly where God is. Where is he in suffering? His arms are reached out to us. He's carrying us on his shoulders.
What do we have to look forward to? What do we cling to as we face life's dark moments?
If one is an unbeliever, they wrestle with that question. But believers look beyond the present pain. Believers take the long view. I have counseled numerous people, and I've talked to many, many people dying in hospitals with cancer. I've talked to hundreds of people in the former Soviet Union